A wealthy businessman's perfect life was disrupted when a young black woman claimed to be his daughter from a past relationship. Determined to prove her wrong, he demanded a DNA test, only to discover she wasn't just his daughter, but also the rightful heir to his family's entire fortune due to being the firstborn. Now he must face his past choices and the daughter he never knew he had. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Arthur Reeves's power, felt cold and alien beneath his fingertips. The crisp scent of expensive paper couldn't mask the metallic tang of fear churning in his stomach. Zara's presence, a vibrant splash of color in his monochrome world, felt like an intrusion, a disruption to the perfectly orchestrated symphony of his life. He hadn't anticipated this, the casual fling from 25 years ago manifesting as a beautiful, intelligent woman claiming his name, his blood. Mr. Reeves, Zara's voice, soft yet firm, cut through his turmoil. She sat opposite him, her posture straight, her gaze steady. The expensive suit he wore, usually a source of confidence, felt suddenly inadequate. I understand this is difficult, but I want to understand. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound brittle. Understand what exactly? The audacity of a woman who insinuates herself into my life? He tried for icy detachment, but a tremor betrayed him. His carefully constructed composure, built on years of ruthless ambition, was cracking under the weight of the truth. The DNA results lay on his desk, irrefutable evidence of a past he had buried deep. Zara's expression softened, a hint of sadness clouding her eyes. I understand you're shocked, but I haven't come here to disrupt your life, only to find my place in it. My mother, she never spoke ill of you, but she also never explained your absence. The delicate gold chain around her neck caught the light, a tiny glint mirroring the fragile hope in her eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The hum of the city outside seemed to amplify Arthur's inner turmoil. The weight of his past choices pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket woven from regret and denial. He knew he had to say something, to break the tense silence that hung between them, but the words wouldn't come. The perfectly sculpted facade he had maintained for so long began to crumble, revealing the lonely, frightened man beneath. The air in Arthur's opulent office, usually scented with expensive leather and polished wood, felt thick with unspoken accusations. Sunlight, filtered through the cityscape, cast long shadows across the mahogany desk, highlighting the stark contrast between Zara's quiet dignity and Arthur's simmering unease. He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil raging beneath his meticulously controlled exterior. The DNA report, a crisp white rectangle, seemed to mock him with its stark simplicity. He had tried to dismiss it, to argue, to deny, but the truth was a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. My mother, she loved you, Zara said softly, breaking the suffocating silence. Her voice, though low, carried a weight of unspoken pain. She touched the gold chain, a delicate heirloom, a tangible link to a past Arthur had ruthlessly erased. The faint clink of the chain against her silk blouse was the only sound for a long moment. Arthur flinched. The word loved struck him like a physical blow. He had never considered his actions in those terms. He had justified his abandonment as pragmatism, as a necessary sacrifice for his ambitious climb. But Zara's gentle statement stripped away those self-serving justifications, leaving him raw and exposed. She never spoke badly of you, Zara continued, her gaze unwavering. But her silence, it was heavy, a constant question mark hanging over my life. She paused, her breath catching slightly. The quiet strength in her voice belied the vulnerability in her eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored a hidden crack in Arthur's own carefully constructed defenses. He watched her, truly saw her for the first time, not as a threat to his empire, but as a woman burdened by a past she had never chosen. A woman who deserved answers, deserved understanding, deserved a father. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a crushing weight of regret. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some feeble explanation, some pathetic attempt at justification, but the words caught in his throat. The silence stretched, filled only with the faint hum of the city outside and the unspoken sorrow that hung heavy in the air. The perfectly crafted mask began to slip. The carefully constructed edifice of his life stood on shaky ground. He was not invincible. He was not alone. He had a daughter. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Arthur's power, now felt like a cold, imposing barrier between him and Zara. He picked up a crystal paperweight, its facets catching the late afternoon sun, a tiny replica of the city skyline glittering in his hand. The weight of it, both literal and metaphorical, was crushing. He hadn't felt this exposed, this vulnerable in decades. Zara sat opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap, her posture radiating a quiet strength that belied the turmoil he sensed simmering beneath the surface. The scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, hung in the air, a fragrant counterpoint to the sterile scent of his office. I didn't know," Arthur finally managed, his voice a low, rough rasp. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to encompass the years of silence, the deliberate avoidance, the callous disregard. Zara's eyes, the same warm brown as the leather of his favorite chair, held a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I wasn't expecting a parade, Mr. Reeves. Just acknowledgement." He flinched at the formality, the polite distance she maintained. He had built walls around himself for so long, constructed a fortress of success and solitude, that he didn't know how to bridge the chasm that separated them. He set the paperweight down with a clink that echoed in the sudden silence. "Your mother," he began, the words catching in his throat again. The memory of a younger, reckless self, a life lived without consequence, flashed before his eyes. He saw a vibrant young woman with a laugh that could fill a room, a woman he had carelessly hurt. "She loved you?" Zara repeated, her voice barely a whisper, this time laced with a hint of accusation. "But she never spoke ill of you. She hoped you would find me someday." The hope in her voice, the unspoken forgiveness, cut him deeper than any accusation ever could. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his own regret, a shared burden of a past they couldn't change, but could perhaps begin to understand. The weight of his past choices, the years of self-deception, threatened to suffocate him. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words remained trapped, tangled in the threads of his guilt. He was a man used to controlling every aspect of his life, and this was beyond his control. This was about facing the consequences of his actions, and the daunting prospect of rebuilding a relationship built on years of absence. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions, the fragile truce hanging precariously in the balance. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the city's twilight painted the cityscape in hues of orange and purple outside Arthur's panoramic window. The air, usually scented with expensive leather and polished mahogany, now carried the faint, lingering aroma of Zara's jasmine perfume, a persistent reminder of the chasm that separated them. He watched her, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp, the delicate curve of her neck, the way her fingers traced the rim of her untouched teacup. He saw a reflection of his own suppressed emotions in her quiet dignity. He had always controlled his environment, dictated the flow of conversations, but here he was adrift, his usual mastery utterly useless. "Your mother," he began again, his voice a low rumble, the words catching in his throat like shards of glass. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the vast, opulent office. "She was remarkable." The statement felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the gulf of years and unspoken regrets. Zara's gaze lifted, meeting his. Her eyes, the same warm brown as the worn leather of his favorite armchair, held a depth of sorrow that mirrored his own. She agreed, her voice low and steady, devoid of bitterness. "She spoke of you often, not with anger but with hope, a stubborn, unwavering hope." He flinched. "Hope? A word that felt alien in the sterile confines of his meticulously crafted life. A life built on calculated risks and carefully constructed facades. He had never allowed himself the luxury of hope, fearing its inherent vulnerability. Now, staring into Zara's compassionate gaze, he understood the profound loss he had inflicted, not only on her mother, but on himself. The weight of his past pressed down on him, the years of self-deception heavy on his shoulders. He wanted to reach out, to offer some semblance of comfort, but his hands remained clenched, his body rigid with a lifetime of suppressed emotion. He saw the resemblance to his own mother in Zara's elegant features, the slight upturn of her lips a mirror of his own late mother's smile. He'd forgotten what warmth truly felt like. A tear traced a path down Zara's cheek, a single solitary tear that spoke volumes of unspoken pain and stifled resentment. The carefully constructed walls of his emotional fortress crumbled, brick by agonizing brick, revealing the terrified, lonely man beneath. The city lights blurred through his suddenly tear-filled eyes. He had lived a life of opulence, but he'd been bankrupt of genuine human connection. This unexpected daughter, this unexpected heir, held the key to a life he hadn't dared to dream of. A life beyond the cold, impersonal gleam of his success. His perfect life wasn't perfect at all. It was empty. The sterile white of the laboratory seemed to amplify the silence. Arthur, usually so composed, felt a tremor run through him as the doctor placed the DNA report on the polished mahogany desk. The crisp, official-looking document felt like a verdict, sentencing him to a life he hadn't anticipated. He avoided Zara's eyes, the scent of her jasmine perfume a sharp contrast to the antiseptic smell of the room. He picked up the report, his fingers clumsy, the paper crinkling under his touch. The words blurred, a nauseating swirl of black ink on white. He cleared his throat, the sound cracking in the heavy silence. It's positive, he managed, his voice a dry whisper. Zara's gaze was fixed on him, unwavering, her expression unreadable. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, a poignant metaphor for the unsettled dust of his past swirling around him. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a cautious hope, perhaps, or a wary expectation. He couldn't tell. I knew it, she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. There was no triumphant shout of victory, no angry accusation, just a quiet statement of fact. The weight of years of uncertainty, of longing and unspoken dreams, hung heavy in the air between them. He'd expected anger, resentment, a storm of accusations. This quiet acceptance was far more unsettling. Arthur flinched, the cold reality of his actions hitting him with full force. He'd spent his life building walls, erecting barriers against vulnerability, and now, those walls were crumbling under the weight of a truth he tried so desperately to ignore. The laboratory's cool air couldn't mask the sudden sweat beading on his forehead. He felt the familiar icy grip of panic tightening around his chest. This wasn't just about a paternity test. It was about the unraveling of his carefully constructed life. His empire, built on ruthless ambition and calculated risks, suddenly felt precarious, threatened by a young woman he'd never known, a woman who held the key to his past and the future of his legacy. He stared at the report, the stark black and white a mirror to his own stark, terrifying reality. His perfect life was shattered, and the pieces, sharp and jagged, were cutting him deeply. The lawyer's office smelled of old leather and expensive cigars. A scent that usually soothed Arthur now felt suffocating. He sat across from Mr. Harding, a man whose face held the same cold calculation Arthur usually admired. "The will is unambiguous, Mr. Reeves," Harding stated, his voice smooth as polished granite. "Zara Reeves is your eldest child and the sole heir." Arthur's fingers drummed a frantic rhythm on the mahogany desk, the polished surface reflecting his strained face. The afternoon sunlight, filtering through the tall windows, cast long shadows that seemed to mock his powerlessness. "There must be some loophole," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. The fear clawing at him was raw, visceral. He'd built this empire brick by brick, and now it was threatened by a daughter he'd never acknowledged. "I'm afraid not, Mr. Reeves. The legal implications are substantial." Harding's tone remained unchanged, a chilling neutrality that underscored the finality of the situation. He pushed a document across the desk, a mountain of legal jargon that seemed to amplify Arthur's despair. The sharp scent of his own expensive cologne suddenly felt cloying, a suffocating reminder of his carefully constructed world, now crumbling around him. He could almost taste the bitterness of defeat, a bitter metallic tang on his tongue. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against his carefully built defenses. He glanced at the window, the city sprawling below, a concrete jungle he'd conquered. But this battle, this fight for control of his life and legacy, was one he was losing. Zara's image flashed in his mind, her quiet strength, her unwavering gaze. She wasn't just a threat. She was a reflection of the life he'd avoided, a life he now felt compelled to face. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, suffocating him. He closed his eyes, feeling the first tremors of a long-overdue emotional earthquake. The fight wasn't over, but its nature had changed. He would fight, not for his empire, but for a chance, however small, to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Arthur's trembling hands. He stared at the legal documents, the crisp white paper mocking his carefully constructed world. The lawyer's words echoed in his ears. Sole heir. The scent of old leather and cigars, once comforting, now felt acrid, a physical manifestation of his growing unease. He pushed the papers away, the action a small rebellion against the crushing weight of reality. This can't be right," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the cavernous silence of the lawyer's office. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, turning the room into a stage for his personal drama. Harding, impassive as ever, merely adjusted his glasses. "The DNA evidence is conclusive, Mr. Reeves. The will is ironclad." His voice, devoid of any emotion, felt like a final judgment. Arthur stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor, a jarring sound in the suffocating quiet. He paced, the expensive Persian rug a soft but futile buffer against the turmoil raging within him. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, the gesture betraying the carefully maintained composure that had always been his shield. "But I never—" he began, the words failing him. The truth, harsh and unforgiving, hung heavy in the air. He hadn't just lost control of his fortune. He'd lost control of his life, his carefully constructed narrative. He'd lost his carefully constructed self. He stopped pacing, his gaze settling on the cityscape outside the window, a concrete jungle he'd once viewed as his personal kingdom. Now it felt alien, hostile. He saw not a testament to his success, but a mirror reflecting the emptiness at his core. An emptiness he'd tried to fill with wealth and power, a void now gaping open, threatening to swallow him whole. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, a stark contrast to the image he'd always projected. It was a silent admission of defeat, the crumbling of his meticulously built walls. He'd fought for control, but he was losing. And in the face of this loss, a strange, unexpected feeling began to stir within him. A flicker of fear, yes, but also something else. A flicker of something akin to acceptance. The earthquake had begun. The lawyer's office felt colder now, the air thick with the unspoken. Arthur's reflection in the polished mahogany desk showed a man ravaged, the carefully constructed facade crumbling. He hadn't just lost his empire, he'd lost his carefully constructed identity. The cityscape outside, once a symbol of his triumph, now felt like a judgmental eye. He sat heavily, the expensive chair offering no comfort. Harding, a silent, observant shadow, cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves, there are implications beyond the inheritance." Arthur's head snapped up. "Implications? What implications?" His voice, still tight with denial, held a tremor of fear. Ms. Hayes' claim, it impacts other assets. There are trusts, investments, family holdings dating back generations, all tied to the lineage, the firstborn. Harding's words hung in the air, each syllable a hammer blow. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, about a history he'd deliberately erased. His past, the woman he'd abandoned, the child he'd denied, it was all coming back to haunt him, a vengeful ghost demanding its due. He stared at his hands, clenched into fists. The expensive suit, once a symbol of power, felt like a straitjacket. So, she gets everything? The question was more a choked whisper than a statement. Harding inclined his head. Legally, yes, but there are possibilities. Contesting the will, challenging the paternity. He offered these as mere suggestions, not solutions. Arthur dismissed them with a wave of his hand, a gesture devoid of its usual authoritative flair. The fight seemed to drain out of him. The meticulously constructed fortress of his life had been breached, and he was left exposed, vulnerable. The years of calculated moves, of ruthless ambition, seemed meaningless now, reduced to dust by the simple, undeniable fact of his daughter's existence. A chilling thought occurred to him. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a battle for his soul. The fight had begun, and he didn't know if he had the strength to fight back. He was, after all, just a man, and a man without his carefully crafted world felt hollow and strangely lost. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Zara's clothes, a stark contrast to the vibrant floral perfume she usually wore. She sat in the sparsely furnished waiting room, the muted hum of the air conditioning a counterpoint to the frantic beat of her heart. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air, each a tiny, shimmering reminder of the uncertainty swirling within her. She'd spent her life piecing together fragments of a story where her father was a ghost, a whisper in the shadows. Now the ghost was about to become real. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, a sound almost swallowed by the sterile quiet. A door opened and a nurse called her name. Zara rose, her hands clammy, her stomach churning. The corridor felt long and unending, each step echoing her rising anxiety. Entering the doctor's office, she saw him, Arthur Reeves, the man she'd only known through blurry photographs and fragmented stories. He was older, wearier than she'd imagined, his usually sharp features softened by exhaustion. He looked up, his gaze unwavering, a stark contrast to the trembling in his hands. He didn't speak, merely gestured to the chair opposite him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a tiny hammer blow against Zara's already fragile composure. He was a man who controlled everything, yet here, in this sterile white room, control seemed to slip through his grasp. His expensive suit did nothing to mask the tremor in his hands. His carefully constructed world was cracking. Finally, he cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. So, he began, his voice low and hesitant, a stark departure from the commanding tone she'd expected. The test results. His gaze fell to his hands, twisting his wedding band. He paused, drawing a ragged breath. They were conclusive. He didn't need to say more. The unspoken weight of his confession hung heavier than any words could ever convey. The confirmation, which had once felt like a victory, was now a bitter pill. Both of them knew exactly what it meant. Their lives were irrevocably changed. The silence that followed was profound, a chasm filled with years of unspoken words, unlived moments, and a future they now had to navigate together. The weight of it pressed down, heavy and suffocating. The dust motes continued their silent dance, oblivious to the storm raging within the small, quiet room. The doctor's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Zara felt a tremor run through her, not of fear, but of a strange, unsettling calm. The sterile white room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the ticking clock a relentless drumbeat against the silence. Arthur's hands, usually so deft in managing his empire, trembled visibly. He looked older than his years, the carefully constructed facade of his life crumbling before her eyes. "So," Zara finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. The confirmation wasn't the joyous revelation she'd once imagined. Instead, it felt like a heavy stone settling in her stomach. This man, this stranger who was her father, was a wreck. He looked up, his eyes, the same shade of gray as a stormy sea, searching hers. I didn't know," he mumbled, the words rough and strained, like a rusty hinge. I was young, reckless." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The expensive suit, usually a symbol of his power, now seemed to hang loosely on his frame, highlighting his vulnerability. Zara studied him, seeing past the expensive tailoring to the man beneath. A man haunted by his past, a man wrestling with a truth he'd buried for years. The anger she'd anticipated felt distant, replaced by a strange empathy. She understood now the weight of his silence, the burden he carried. "I understand," she said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. The words surprised even her. Forgiveness hadn't been a part of her plan, yet here it was, tentatively offered, a fragile bridge across a vast chasm. The scent of antiseptic seemed less sharp now, dulled by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. The sunlight, previously a symbol of her uncertainty, now felt warm, comforting. A long silence followed, punctuated only by the persistent ticking clock, a relentless reminder of the time lost, the opportunities missed. Arthur reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers. He didn't touch her, not yet. The gesture, however, spoke volumes. His rigid control was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. It was a beginning, however tentative, a first crack in the icy wall he'd built around himself. The dust motes continued their silent dance, but now, they seemed less like reminders of uncertainty and more like tiny sparks of hope, dancing in the newly shifting light. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Zara's clothes, a stark contrast to the perfume she'd worn that morning, a hopeful fragrance now dulled by the weight of revelation. Arthur sat opposite her, the expensive leather of his chair creaking softly under his shifting weight. His usually immaculate hair was slightly disheveled, a small rebellion against his meticulously crafted persona. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh and brittle. I need to understand." Zara met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting a complex tapestry of emotions. Resentment simmered beneath a layer of weariness, the initial shock giving way to a cautious curiosity. "Understand what, Mr. Reeves?" The formality felt oddly out of place, a barrier in the chasm that now separated them. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. "Your mother. I remember snippets, fragments, but the details, they're blurred, clouded by regret." His voice cracked, the carefully constructed wall around his emotions crumbling brick by agonizing brick. The room was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning, a relentless soundtrack to their unspoken accusations and hesitant forgiveness. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air, each a tiny symbol of the past's lingering presence. Zara shifted, the uncomfortable stiffness in her chair mirroring the turmoil in her heart. She had expected anger, righteous fury even, but the reality was far more complicated. A tangled web of grief, empathy, and the crushing weight of unmet expectations. "It's not about the money," Zara said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the machinery. The words were a surprise, even to herself. The inheritance was monumental, a life-altering sum, yet it paled in comparison to the gaping hole left by a father she never knew. Arthur looked up, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of something akin to hope in their depths. "Then what is it about?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "It's about knowing," Zara replied, her gaze unwavering. "About understanding why you left, why you chose silence, why I only exist now because of a DNA test." Her voice trembled slightly, the years of unanswered questions finally finding their voice. A long silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, the air thick with the lingering scent of regret. The ticking clock seemed to amplify the silence, each tick a painful reminder of the lost years, the missed opportunities, the stolen moments that could never be reclaimed. The sunlight seemed to fade slightly, mirroring the uncertain path ahead. The beginning, however tentative, was a step towards something new. The beginning of their very complicated story. The mahogany table between them felt cold, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from Zara's hands clasped tightly in her lap. Sunlight slanted across the polished surface, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Arthur, usually so impeccably groomed, looked rumpled, his expensive suit failing to disguise the exhaustion etched onto his face. He nervously adjusted his cufflinks, the sharp click echoing in the otherwise silent room. "My mother," Zara began, her voice low, hesitant. The words felt heavy, laden with years of unspoken questions. She'd rehearsed this conversation countless times in her head, but the reality felt different, sharper, more raw. Arthur shifted, the leather of his chair groaning a sympathetic sigh. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I failed her. I failed you." His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now clouded with a grief that surprised Zara. It wasn't the calculating, cold businessman she'd expected. It was a vulnerable man wrestling with his past. "I don't want your money, Mr. Reeves," Zara repeated, the words surprising even herself. The vast inheritance suddenly felt insignificant compared to the profound emptiness of a fatherless life. She'd expected anger, a burning need for retribution, but the dominant emotion was a weary sadness. She saw a ghost of a man in him, a man she'd never known, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. "Then what do you want?" His voice cracked, the question hanging heavy in the air. The sterile scent of the lawyer's office seemed to intensify, a stark reminder of the cold, clinical nature of their initial encounter. Zara looked away, her gaze settling on a framed photograph on the wall, a picture of a smiling family, one she'd never been a part of. "I want to understand," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I want to know why you abandoned us, why you chose silence over everything." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to years of longing and unmet expectations. The weight of unspoken words, of a lifetime's absence, pressed down on her, a heavy cloak she'd worn for far too long. She needed answers, not money, not pity, but the truth, however painful it might be. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to intensify, a relentless undercurrent to the unspoken emotions filling the room. The beginning of their journey had been fraught with conflict, but in this moment, a glimmer of understanding, however faint, sparked in the shadowed corners of the room. The silence stretched, filled only with the ticking clock and the unspoken history between them, a history that could shape their future, for better or for worse. The lawyer's office felt suffocating, the air thick with the scent of expensive leather and stale coffee. Sunlight, fractured by the city's skyscrapers, cast long shadows across the polished mahogany. Zara sat rigidly, the crisp fabric of her dress a stark contrast to the turmoil within. Arthur's words, confirming her inheritance, hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. He'd expected outrage, a battle, but Zara's silence was more unnerving. "So," Arthur began, his voice tight, the carefully constructed composure cracking at the edges. He ran a hand through his impeccably styled hair, the gesture betraying his inner disarray. "This changes everything." Zara's gaze remained fixed on the ornate carpet, its intricate pattern failing to distract from the weight of the revelation. The vast fortune, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a poisoned chalice. "It does," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, each word tinged with weariness. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile truce. He watched her, a flicker of something akin to fear in his eyes. The power, the control he'd so meticulously cultivated, seemed to slip through his fingers like grains of sand. He had anticipated a fight, a legal battle. He hadn't anticipated this quiet acceptance, this unnerving calm. It was far more terrifying. I want to understand, Zara finally said, lifting her gaze, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger, no accusation, only a deep, weary sadness. The years of yearning, of unanswered questions, had etched themselves onto her face. A subtle map of a life lived without him. Arthur shifted in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and strained. I know I've caused you pain, he began, the words tumbling out in a rush. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly as he brought it to his lips. The water was cool, a fleeting moment of comfort against the scorching heat of his guilt. There's no excuse for my actions, but I want you to know, I wasn't always like this. His voice was raw, devoid of his usual practiced composure. He looked older, suddenly frail, the burden of his past weighing heavily on his shoulders. The lawyer's hushed whispers faded as Zara and Arthur stepped out onto the bustling city street. The cacophony of car horns and shouting vendors was a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of the office. Zara pulled her coat tighter, the chill wind a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil swirling inside her. Arthur watched her, his usual crisp suit rumpled, his face etched with a weariness she'd never seen before. I need some air, he mumbled, his voice barely audible above the city's roar. He paused, then added, This changes everything for me too. The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Zara looked up at the towering skyscrapers, their glass facades reflecting the city's relentless energy, a stark contrast to the stillness in her own heart. She wasn't feeling the elation she'd expected. The inheritance felt like a burden, a testament to a life she hadn't chosen. It does, she replied, her voice low. She shifted her weight, avoiding his gaze. But it doesn't change who I am or what I want. Arthur looked at her, a flicker of something akin to hope in his eyes. He saw the strength in her posture, the quiet dignity that had surprised him in the lawyer's office. He noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, a hint of the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. He suddenly felt the weight of his past actions, the years of silence and absence, pressing down on him with the force of a physical blow. I know, he said, his voice raspy, and I want to make things right. I don't know how, but I want to try. He looked around, the city's noise momentarily swallowed by the profound silence of his own admission. The weight of his words, of his unspoken regrets, seemed to settle on his shoulders, making him seem much older, more vulnerable. Zara saw it. She saw a man stripped bare, not of his wealth, but of his carefully constructed defenses. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. That's a start, she whispered, a hint of hope creeping into her weary voice. The city lights twinkled around them, a silent witness to the fragile beginning of a father-daughter relationship, born not from joy, but from the shared weight of the past and the uncertain promise of the future. The air, still cold, felt slightly less harsh, the city sounds less overwhelming. A small step, but a step nonetheless. The lawyer's sleek, mahogany desk seemed to absorb the weight of the revelation, the polished surface reflecting Zara's stunned face. The sterile scent of antiseptic and expensive leather clung to the air, a stark contrast to the city's vibrant pulse just beyond the window. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second amplifying the gravity of the situation. Arthur, his face a mask of controlled fury, felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just about a paternity claim. This was about the dismantling of his meticulously constructed empire. His carefully curated life, built on ambition and self-reliance, was crumbling before his eyes. This is impossible, he finally rasped, his voice betraying the tremor in his hands. He leaned forward, the expensive fabric of his suit creasing, his gaze fixed on the legal documents. The words blurred, the implications too vast to comprehend. Zara, despite the earthquake rumbling beneath her carefully composed exterior, met his gaze with a quiet strength that surprised even herself. The weight of her past, the years of hardship and uncertainty, seemed to coalesce into a steely resolve. She wouldn't be intimidated. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming her history, her identity. "The documents are clear, Mr. Reeves," the lawyer said, his voice calm yet firm, a stark counterpoint to the rising tension. "Ms. Jones is not only your daughter but, as the firstborn child, the rightful heir to the Reeves family fortune." The weight of those words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Arthur felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a fear far deeper than the mere loss of wealth. It was the fear of facing his past, of confronting the consequences of his choices. He saw Zara's eyes, mirroring a weariness that resonated with his own hidden turmoil. A reluctant respect, a flicker of recognition, ignited between them, a fragile spark in the midst of the storm. The battle lines had been drawn, but in the heart of that conflict, a seed of something else was taking root. The fight for the inheritance had begun, but a far more profound struggle, a fight for recognition, acceptance, and a fractured family's redemption, had just begun. The mahogany table between them felt cold, a stark contrast to the simmering tension in the room. Arthur stared at the legal documents, the crisp paper a mocking reminder of his meticulously ordered life, now shattered. He could taste the metallic tang of fear, a bitter aftertaste to the champagne he'd enjoyed only hours before. Zara, across from him, sat with an unnerving calm, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The expensive silk of her dress seemed to absorb the light, leaving her face shadowed, yet her eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "This changes everything," Arthur finally managed, his voice a low growl. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. The polished floor gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, reflecting the turmoil mirrored in his eyes. Zara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The scent of lilies from the vase on the table, usually a calming presence, now felt suffocating. "It does, doesn't it?" she replied, her voice soft but firm, each word carrying the weight of years of unspoken longing and suppressed anger. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor, a jarring sound in the otherwise silent room. The city lights blurred through the panoramic window, a mesmerizing display of chaos contrasting with the controlled explosion inside him. "This isn't fair," he barked, the words laced with a desperate plea masked by anger. "I built this, everything." Zara's eyes flickered, a momentary vulnerability piercing her composure. "And I've been building my life too without you," she whispered, the words barely audible, yet carrying the weight of decades of struggle. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the rigid composure she'd maintained. He watched that tear, a silent observer to the unraveling of his carefully constructed world. The cold dread he'd felt earlier intensified, morphing into a chilling awareness of his past actions. His past life, his empire, felt like a fragile house of cards, about to topple under the weight of his denial. The fight, he realized, was far from over. It was only just beginning. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco clung to the air in Arthur's study, a stark contrast to the sterile modernity of the rest of his penthouse. He sat slumped in his leather armchair, the mahogany desk a fortress between him and the ghosts of his past. He stared at a faded photograph, a young woman with laughing eyes and a cascade of dark hair, Zara's mother, Evelyn. The image was a tangible link to a reckless youth he'd tried to bury under layers of success. He remembered Evelyn's infectious laugh, the way the sunlight caught in her hair, the hesitant touch of her hand on his arm. Then, the memory shifted, sharp and painful. The cold fear that had gripped him, the panicked retreat, the silence that followed. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, unnoticed until it landed on the photograph, blurring Evelyn's face. The weight of his abandonment pressed down on him, suffocating. He hadn't just abandoned Evelyn. He'd abandoned a part of himself, a capacity for love he'd suppressed for decades. He'd built his empire on a foundation of denial, shielding himself from the vulnerability that love demanded. The memory dissolved, replaced by the image of Zara, her quiet strength a stark contrast to his own turmoil. He tried to dismiss her, to manipulate the legal system, but her unwavering gaze had chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses. He saw in her eyes a reflection of the pain he'd inflicted, the longing he'd ignored. A bitter laugh escaped him, a sound both self-pitying and self-accusing. He picked up the phone, the polished wood cool against his trembling hand. He hesitated, the dial tone a jarring counterpoint to the silence in his heart. He needed answers, not just legal ones, but answers that went deeper, that delved into the murky depths of his own soul. He dialed the number of his old college friend, the only person who knew the truth about his relationship with Evelyn. The line rang, each ring a hammer blow against the walls of his carefully constructed self-deception. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper, raw with a vulnerability he'd long forgotten. "I need to talk," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "About Evelyn." The weight of his past actions, of his choices, pressed down on him. This wasn't just about a lawsuit, a fortune, or a daughter. This was about facing the man he had become, and the man he might yet be. The call would be the first step towards a journey into the unknown, a journey towards redemption. The stale air in Arthur's study hung heavy with the scent of old leather and regret. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm raging inside him. He reread Evelyn's letter, the delicate script a stark contrast to the harshness of his own handwriting scrawled across the margins. Frantic notes, desperate attempts to deny the truth he now couldn't ignore. The crisp paper felt brittle under his trembling fingers. He slammed the letter down, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. His phone buzzed, a jarring interruption. It was his lawyer, Mr. Harding, his voice a smooth, polished blade. "The DNA results are irrefutable, Mr. Reeves. Miss Zara Reeves is indeed your daughter and the legal heir." Arthur's breath hitched. I understand." His voice was a cracked whisper, devoid of the usual authoritative tone. Harding's voice continued, laced with professional concern. "We can still contest this, explore other legal avenues?" "No," Arthur interrupted, the word a low growl. He stared out at the rain-streaked city, a cityscape he'd once surveyed with arrogant satisfaction. Now it felt alien, cold, indifferent to his turmoil. He didn't want to fight Zara anymore. The fight had already cost him too much: Evelyn's love, his own peace of mind, a lifetime of self-deception. The silence stretched, a heavy blanket suffocating the space between him and the cold, impersonal voice on the other end of the phone. He finally hung up, the click a final punctuation mark to a chapter of his life. He walked to the window, the cold glass a stark contrast to his burning cheeks. He hadn't just lost a fortune. He'd lost years, a lifetime of chances to know his daughter. The rain continued its relentless assault, mirroring the tempest in his soul. He needed to find Evelyn's sister, the only other person who might know where Evelyn is. This search would be another act of reconciliation with his past, an act that demanded both courage and humility. He'd start tomorrow. The next morning, Arthur's penthouse felt strangely empty, despite the opulence. Sunlight glinted off the polished mahogany, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the silent air. He picked up Evelyn's faded photograph, a young woman with laughing eyes and a cascade of dark hair, strikingly similar to Zara. A pang of guilt, sharp and sudden, pierced his chest. He'd locked this memory away, buried it under layers of ambition and self-preservation. He dialed a number, his hand trembling slightly. It was Evelyn's sister, Clara's number, a lead he'd found tucked away in a dusty address book. The phone rang, each tone a hammer blow against his resolve. Finally, a woman's voice, hesitant and weary, answered. "Hello, Clara? This is Arthur Reeves," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words felt alien, clumsy on his tongue. A long silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of the city outside. Then, a shaky breath. "Arthur? It's been a long time." He swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breathing. "I need to talk to you about Evelyn, about Zara." He felt a tremor run through him, a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Clara's voice was laced with suspicion. "What do you want, Arthur? After all these years?" He explained, his words tumbling out in a rush, the weight of his past actions crushing him. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Finally, Clara agreed to meet, her voice still cautious, but with a hint of something akin to curiosity. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, at a quiet cafe near Clara's home. A tiny spark of hope flickered within him, fragile yet persistent, promising a path towards redemption, one small step at a time. The rain had stopped, the city basking in a tentative, uncertain sunlight, mirroring Arthur's own fragile state of mind. The cafe, nestled on a quiet cobbled street, smelled of roasted coffee beans and old books. Rain-slicked cobblestones glistened under the weak afternoon sun. Arthur sat, nervously fiddling with a sugar packet, his tailored suit feeling oddly out of place amidst the worn armchairs and mismatched tables. He watched the door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He hadn't seen Clara in decades. A lifetime compressed into the space between then and now, a lifetime of regrets. Clara arrived, her silhouette framed in the doorway, a woman etched with time's passage, yet bearing a resemblance to the woman in the faded photograph. Her eyes, dark and intense, held a mixture of weariness and guarded suspicion. She sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Arthur cleared his throat. "Clara, He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He hadn't anticipated the sheer weight of his confession. Clara's voice was low, a husky whisper. "You found me after all these years. What do you want, Arthur?" Her gaze was unwavering, assessing him with a keen intelligence that unsettled him. He noticed a faint tremor in her hands, mirroring his own internal turmoil. He took a deep breath, the scent of coffee momentarily grounding him. I need to tell you about Evelyn and Zara. She's my daughter." The words felt raw, exposed, leaving him vulnerable. He watched Clara's reaction carefully. Her face remained impassive, her expression unreadable. "I know," Clara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The unexpectedness of her statement stunned him. He leaned forward, his apprehension deepening. "She contacted me years ago. She knew," Clara continued, her gaze dropping to her hands. "But I didn't tell her about you. I wanted to protect her." A wave of relief washed over Arthur, quickly followed by a surge of guilt. He had tried to bury his past, to erase it, but it had merely manifested in a different, more devastating way. "I understand," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I deserve that. I abandoned Evelyn. I was a coward." He flinched slightly under the weight of his own words. He looked at Clara. Her expression held a hint of sorrow, but also a flicker of something else, understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. The possibility was a fragile lifeline in the sea of his self-recrimination. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the cafe, mirroring the long road ahead. The mahogany desk gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Arthur's opulent office, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. He paced, the plush carpet muffling his agitated steps, the scent of expensive leather and old money doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. His lawyers, Stern and Miller, sat opposite, their faces impassive masks of professional detachment. The air hung heavy with unspoken anxieties. "They're digging," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "Zara's lawyers are relentless. They're uncovering every detail of your past, every questionable transaction, every indiscretion." Arthur stopped pacing, his back ramrod straight. "Indiscretions? They're trying to dismantle my life." His voice, usually calm and controlled, cracked with barely contained fury. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a familiar sensation of dread washing over him. Stern, a wiry man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Mr. Reeves, we advised you against this. Fighting Zara will only make things worse. The DNA results are undeniable. The public is already buzzing." The image of Zara's calm, determined face flashed before his eyes. Her strength, her quiet dignity, was a stark contrast to his own desperate machinations. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the consequences of his actions. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sharp sound echoing in the cavernous office. "Damn it! This isn't just about money. It's about my life, my reputation, everything I've built." His voice trembled, betraying the carefully constructed facade of control. Miller sighed, pushing a file across the polished surface. "These are the preliminary findings on your relationship with Ms. Evelyn Hayes, Zara's mother. It seems thorough." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Arthur stared at the file, his heart pounding. He knew what it contained. A messy tangle of youthful indiscretion and regret, a testament to the life he had tried so desperately to bury. The past, it seemed, was refusing to stay buried. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, the scent of expensive cologne suddenly cloying and suffocating. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, brick by brick, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, facing the consequences of a life lived in denial. The weight of his actions, the weight of his lies, pressed down upon him, threatening to crush him beneath their burden. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of the private investigator's dimly lit office. Arthur, his usually impeccable suit rumpled, sat across from a woman whose sharp gaze belied her gentle smile. He shifted uncomfortably, the plush leather of the chair offering little comfort. "Ms. Hayes, Evelyn," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I understand you have information about my past." Evelyn's smile didn't waver. She leaned forward, her eyes, the same shade of deep brown as Zara's, assessing him with unsettling accuracy. "Information is a rather bland term, Mr. Reeves. I have memories. Memories of a young man, impulsive, charming, reckless. A man who promised the moon and then vanished without a trace." A sharp pang of guilt pierced Arthur's carefully constructed defenses. He flinched, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken accusations. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and unconvincing. I wasn't ready. I was young, building my business. It wasn't the right time." His justification felt hollow even to his own ears. Evelyn's gaze softened, a flicker of empathy momentarily replacing the steel in her eyes. "Ready for what, Arthur? For responsibility? For love? Or for the societal expectations that stifled your own heart?" Her words were a gentle yet piercing indictment, exposing the flimsy fabric of his excuses. A photograph lay on the desk between them, a faded snapshot of a laughing young couple, Arthur, barely recognizable beneath a mop of unruly dark hair, his arm around a radiant Evelyn. The image was a stark reminder of a life he'd tried so hard to erase. He reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly. The memory, a stolen kiss under a moonlit sky, the whispered promises of forever, resurfaced, poignant and painful. I was a fool," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of his past crushing him. Evelyn nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "You were, but you are not that same fool anymore. At least I hope not." Her voice held a hint of hope, a glimmer of forgiveness that surprised him. It was a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, a crack that the rising sun of truth might just break wide open. The scent of old paper and regret filled the air, a testament to a past seeking reconciliation. The interview wasn't over, but for the first time, Arthur felt a glimmer of redemption might be within reach. The mahogany of Arthur's desk felt cold beneath his fingertips. He stared at the meticulously organized files, each representing a carefully constructed facet of his empire, now threatened by the seismic shift Zara's arrival had caused. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window, mirroring the turmoil inside him. His phone buzzed, a relentless reminder of the legal battle brewing. It was his lead attorney, Mr. Harding, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "Mr. Reeves, the preliminary injunction has been denied. Miss Hayes. She's incredibly well represented." Arthur ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Damn it," he muttered, the words catching in his throat. The fear wasn't just about losing his fortune. It was the fear of facing the consequences of his past actions, of the man he had been. He slammed the phone down, the sharp sound echoing the hollowness inside him. He hadn't anticipated Zara's resilience, her quiet strength a stark contrast to his frantic attempts to control the situation. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid a momentary distraction from the gnawing guilt. He thought of Evelyn's words, her piercing gaze, the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air of that dimly lit office. He tried to bury that part of his life, to erase the memory of Evelyn and the promise he had broken. But the past, it seemed, had a way of finding you. A knock on the door. His assistant, hesitant, announced, "Mr. Reeves, there's a young woman here to see you. She says her name is Zara." He hesitated, the ice in his whiskey clinking softly against the glass. This wasn't a legal battle. This was a confrontation with his own soul. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of something akin to anticipation. He took a deep breath, the scent of expensive leather and old wood filling his nostrils. "Send her in," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. The whiskey, perhaps, or maybe something else entirely. He was ready, or as ready as he could ever be, to face the daughter he denied for so long. The game was no longer about control. It was about facing the truth. And the truth, he knew, would be far more painful than any legal battle. The legal battle raged, a tempest of paperwork and depositions swirling around Arthur. His normally pristine office, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos, was now littered with files, discarded coffee cups, and the lingering scent of stale fear. He paced, the polished mahogany floor cool beneath his bare feet, the silence broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Harding's words echoed. "She's incredibly well represented." The implication hung heavy. Zara wasn't just fighting for a share of his wealth. She was fighting for her rightful place. A sudden, sharp rap on the door startled him. His assistant, Brenda, her face etched with concern, peeked in. "Mr. Reeves, there's a private investigator here to see you. Says it's about Miss Hayes." Arthur felt a chill crawl down his spine. This wasn't about Zara's legal team. This was a personal attack. He motioned Brenda in. "Send him in, but keep the door open." The investigator, a burly man with eyes that missed nothing, presented himself as a Mr. Silas. He spoke in clipped tones, his words precise and devoid of emotion. "I've been hired to gather information on Miss Hayes' past. Discrepancies have arisen concerning her claimed background." He slid a manila envelope across the desk. "This contains evidence contradicting some of her claims." However, Silas paused, his gaze unwavering. "There are also indications suggesting a possible cover-up on your part, Mr. Reeves." Arthur felt a cold sweat break out. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling. He stared at the envelope, his mind a whirlwind of fear and self-preservation. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. The game had changed. This wasn't just about money or power anymore. It was about survival. But what was he protecting? The life he'd built, or the guilt he'd been so diligently trying to bury? The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, threatening to suffocate him. Silas's words hung in the air, a grim prophecy of the truth that was about to be exposed. The truth he desperately wanted to keep hidden, but suddenly knew he couldn't anymore. The manila envelope felt heavy in Arthur's trembling hand. Silas's words, sharp as shards of glass, echoed in the opulent silence of his office. The scent of old paper and fear mingled with the faint aroma of expensive leather from his desk. He didn't open it. He couldn't. Not yet. He needed time, a strategy. He slammed the phone down, the jarring sound a counterpoint to the turmoil within. Brenda, ever vigilant, hovered near the door, her expression a mixture of concern and apprehension. He dismissed her with a curt wave, needing solitude to dissect the sudden, terrifying shift in the game. The investigator's veiled threat, a cover-up, hung over him like a dark cloud. His perfectly constructed life, a fortress built on ambition and denial, was cracking at the seams. The weight of his past, once meticulously buried, threatened to crush him. He walked to the window, the city sprawling beneath him a glittering tapestry of indifference. He saw Zara's face in his mind's eye, defiant, intelligent, yet burdened by a past she hadn't chosen. A wave of guilt washed over him, bitter and unexpected. He hadn't just abandoned her mother. He'd abandoned a part of himself. A soft knock. He didn't need to look to know it was Zara. He hadn't anticipated her visit. His throat tightened, a knot of fear and something akin to anticipation twisting inside him. "Mr. Reeves?" Her voice, soft yet firm, cut through the suffocating silence. He turned, his face a mask of controlled composure. "Miss Hayes, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Zara stepped inside, her presence filling the vast space. Her eyes, the color of dark chocolate, held a quiet intensity that unsettled him. She carried herself with an unwavering dignity that he hadn't expected, a strength he had underestimated. "I received some unsettling information," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About my mother. About you." She paused, her gaze steady. "Mr. Silas, he mentioned you." The silence stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken accusations. The grandfather clock chimed, each toll a hammer blow against his defenses. He knew with a sickening certainty that the game was truly over. The fight wasn't about money or power anymore. It was about truth, and the truth, he realized with a shudder, was about to bury him. Zara's words hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. The scent of expensive cigars, usually a comforting presence in Arthur's office, now felt cloying, suffocating. He felt a tremor run through him, not of fear exactly, but a deep, bone-chilling dread. He looked at Zara, truly looked at her, not as a legal challenge or a threat to his empire, but as a woman, a daughter. He saw the weariness etched around her eyes, the subtle tightening of her jaw. He saw himself reflected in her strength, a strength he'd never possessed, a strength he'd suppressed for decades. "Silas," he began, his voice raspy, the words catching in his throat. He cleared it, trying for a tone of controlled indifference, but the effort felt hollow even to him. "He's exaggerating." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Zara stepped closer, the polished mahogany floor creaking softly beneath her elegant heels. The soft light from the cityscape cast long shadows across her face, accentuating the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the determined set of her lips. "Is he?" Her voice was low, a husky whisper that cut through the suffocating silence. He swallowed hard. "There were complications," he admitted, the word feeling inadequate, pathetic. He gestured vaguely towards the window, the glittering expanse of the city offering no solace. "A messy past, things I'd rather forget." "I think you'll find," Zara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in his own, "that some things are impossible to forget, especially when they involve someone's life." The scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, reached him, surprisingly comforting amidst the turmoil. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. The weight of his actions, the years of carefully constructed lies, threatened to crush him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not an enemy, but a reflection of a self he'd buried deep within his carefully cultivated persona. The image of a younger, reckless Arthur flashed before his eyes, the ghost of a man he hardly recognized. A man who had chosen ambition over love, power over family. The city lights seemed to blur, the sharp edges softening into a hazy, indistinct landscape. He felt a profound sadness wash over him, a raw, aching emptiness that had been dormant for far too long. He had much to atone for. The game indeed was over, but a new one had begun. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Arthur's power, felt cold and alien beneath his fingertips. He stared at the cityscape, a million shimmering lights blurring into an indistinct glow. The scent of Zara's jasmine perfume lingered faintly in the air, a stark contrast to the stale cigar smoke that usually clung to the room. He dismissed her initial claims as a shakedown, a brazen attempt at exploiting his wealth. Now, facing the irrefutable truth of their shared DNA, a crushing weight of guilt settled on his shoulders. Complications, he'd mumbled, the word a pathetic understatement for the years of deliberate avoidance, the life he'd built on a foundation of lies. He thought of Eleanor, Zara's mother, her bright smile, her fierce spirit, a spirit he'd so carelessly extinguished. Zara's silence was more damning than any accusation. She moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the cityscape, a stark contrast to his slumped posture. The city lights reflected in her eyes, glittering like unshed tears. "You abandoned her," Zara finally said, her voice low, measured. The words weren't an attack, but a simple statement of fact, heavy with unspoken pain. Arthur flinched. He tried to justify his actions, to bury them under layers of success and self-deception. But Zara's quiet pronouncement stripped away those defenses, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. I was young," he stammered, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "I didn't know what I was doing." "You knew enough to leave," Zara countered, her gaze unwavering. "You knew enough to build an empire while she struggled. You knew enough to never look back." He felt the sting of her words, a sharp contrast to the numb ache that had settled in his chest. He looked at her, really saw her, not as a legal challenge, but as a reflection of a past he desperately tried to erase. A past that, despite his efforts, continued to haunt him. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city. The weight of his silence, the unspoken accusations, pressed down on him. He needed to explain, to justify, to somehow mitigate the devastation he'd wrought. Yet, the words eluded him, trapped in the suffocating grip of guilt. He'd built a life based on denial, on carefully constructed walls of wealth and power. Now those walls crumbled, revealing the fragile, broken man beneath. The game indeed was over, but this was not the end. It was just the beginning of a long, arduous journey of reckoning, of atonement, and perhaps, just perhaps, of redemption. The city lights blurred through Zara's tears. The penthouse apartment, usually a symbol of Arthur's success, felt suffocating. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars clashed violently with the faint, lingering sweetness of Zara's jasmine perfume. She turned from the window, her eyes, dark and luminous, fixed on Arthur. He sat hunched in his leather chair, a defeated king on a crumbling throne. "It wasn't just about money, was it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet cutting through the oppressive silence. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat making the simple act feel monumental. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. He hadn't anticipated this quiet strength, this unwavering gaze that stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. He'd expected anger, outrage. He'd prepared for a legal battle, a fight for his empire. But Zara's quiet dignity was more potent than any shouted accusation. "No," he finally managed, his voice raspy. "It wasn't." He looked away, ashamed, unable to meet her steady gaze. He saw her reflection in the polished surface of his desk, a young woman who carried the weight of a past he had tried to erase. He closed his eyes, the memories flooding back. Eleanor's radiant smile, her laughter, the simple joy of their fleeting time together. The fear had been overwhelming, the fear of societal judgment, of ruining his carefully crafted future. But now, facing the consequences, The fear felt insignificant compared to the crushing weight of his regret. "I was afraid," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of everything." He opened his eyes, searching for understanding in Zara's dark eyes. The silence stretched, filled only with the soft hum of the city outside. He knew a simple apology wouldn't suffice, couldn't possibly undo the years of pain he'd caused. But it was a start, a tentative, fragile first step toward a future he never dared to imagine. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of cool, controlled elegance, felt stifling. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm brewing inside Arthur. Zara sat opposite him, the low light catching the sheen of her dark skin, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheekbone. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and a growing awareness of shared history. The scent of expensive mahogany and polished leather warred with the subtle, earthy fragrance of the lilies Zara had brought, a fragile peace offering in a room charged with tension. "I found a photo," Zara said, her voice quiet, measured. She slid a faded photograph across the glass tabletop. It showed a younger Arthur, his hair darker, his eyes alight with a reckless energy Zara had never seen in the man sitting before her. Beside him, a radiant young woman with a smile that mirrored Zara's own. Eleanor. Arthur's hand trembled as he picked up the picture. The memory, a vibrant splash of color in his monochrome past, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He saw himself young and arrogant, oblivious to the consequences of his actions. The woman's laughter echoed in his mind, a haunting melody of what he'd lost. She was beautiful, he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at Zara, seeing a reflection of Eleanor in her eyes, a shared strength, a shared sorrow. The bitterness of regret coated his tongue, a bitter taste he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about money. It was about a life he'd carelessly discarded, a daughter he'd never known. He saw the pain in Zara's eyes, a pain he had inflicted, a pain he now desperately wanted to alleviate. "She loved you," Zara said, her voice soft, almost a statement of fact rather than an accusation. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. It wasn't a judgment, but a simple, heartbreaking observation. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, a rhythmic counterpoint to the turmoil within the room. Arthur looked at the photograph again, a silent plea for forgiveness etched onto his weary face. The battle for his empire was fading into insignificance. He had a far greater battle ahead, a battle for his daughter's heart, a battle for his own redemption. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Arthur's power, felt oppressive. He pushed away the legal documents, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the turmoil in his gut. The rain outside had intensified, a furious drumming against the glass. He rubbed his temples, the sharp ache a physical manifestation of his inner conflict. Zara's words echoed in his ears. "She loved you." The weight of that simple statement pressed down on him, heavier than any legal battle. He paced the room, the polished floor cold beneath his bare feet. He pictured Eleanor, her laughter, the way the sunlight caught the gold in her hair. A phantom touch, the ghost of a kiss lingered on his lips, a memory both vivid and agonizing. He'd buried that part of himself, walled it off with ambition and success. But Zara's arrival had shattered the carefully constructed facade. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling. He needed to talk to someone, to unravel the tangled mess of his past. He dialed his oldest friend, Robert, his voice strained as he spoke. "Robert, it's Arthur. I need to talk about Eleanor." The confession hung in the air, heavy and fraught with regret. Robert's voice, laced with concern, broke through the storm inside him. "I'm coming over," Robert said, the simple words offering a lifeline. Hours later, Robert sat across from Arthur, a bottle of expensive scotch between them. The air hung heavy with unspoken words and the scent of old leather and regret. Arthur poured 2 glasses, his hand unsteady. He spoke of Eleanor, of his youthful arrogance, his fear, his selfishness. He confessed his abandonment, the crushing weight of his societal pressures, the gnawing emptiness that had haunted him for decades. Robert listened patiently, his gaze understanding and sympathetic, occasionally offering a nod or a knowing sigh. As Arthur spoke, a wave of self-loathing washed over him. He saw himself not as a successful businessman, but as a coward, a man who had traded love for ambition. He watched Robert take a sip of scotch, observing his friend's stoic expression. "She deserved better," Robert finally said, his voice low and grave. The words hung in the silence, a simple truth that cut through Arthur's carefully constructed defenses. The rain had stopped, but the storm within Arthur raged on, a necessary cleansing. The following morning, sunlight sliced through the gaps in Arthur's heavy drapes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He awoke with a headache, the remnants of Robert's scotch clinging to his breath. The confession had been a catharsis, a purging of years of suppressed guilt. Yet the emptiness remained, a vast, echoing void. He looked at the photograph on his nightstand, Eleanor, her smile radiant, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous light. He hadn't seen that picture in decades. He showered, the hot water a temporary balm against the lingering chill of his soul. He needed to face Zara. He couldn't continue to hide behind lawyers and legal maneuvers. The thought filled him with a mixture of dread and a strange, unsettling anticipation. He found Zara in the library, sunlight illuminating the dust motes there as well, surrounded by ancient law books. She looked up, her expression unreadable. The tension between them was palpable, thick as the air in the stuffy room. I wanted to apologize," Arthur began, his voice hesitant. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. Zara didn't reply immediately, her gaze fixed on him, assessing. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe suspicion, maybe hope? The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. "For what?" she finally asked, her voice quiet, controlled. The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. "For everything," he said, the simple words carrying the weight of years. "For my absence, for my silence, for the pain I've caused you." He watched her face, searching for any sign of softening, any indication of forgiveness. He saw none. "Saying sorry doesn't change the past," she said, her voice low, laced with a weariness that mirrored his own. She closed the book she'd been reading, the sound a small but decisive action. "I know," he replied, his voice raw with emotion. "But I want to try to change the future. I want to know you, to be your father." The words felt vulnerable, exposed, but he couldn't stop them. Zara hesitated, then stood, walking towards a window overlooking the sprawling gardens. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. "It's not that easy," she murmured, her voice barely audible. 23 years of not knowing you. There's a lot to unpack." The vulnerability in her voice mirrored his own. A shared silence fell between them, a silent acknowledgement of the vast chasm that separated them. Yet, amidst it, a glimmer of something new began to form, a fragile connection forged in shared sorrow and a hesitant hope for the future. The scent of rain-soaked earth now felt less like a reminder of the storm that had passed, but the beginning of a spring thaw. The mahogany desk in Arthur's study felt cold beneath his fingertips. He traced the grain, the polished wood, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. Outside, the city hummed, a relentless symphony of ambition and indifference, mirroring his own inner conflict. He'd spent days poring over old photographs, dusty journals, and faded letters, each a painful reminder of his past. Eleanor's face, young and vibrant, haunted him. He'd found a letter, her handwriting delicate and hopeful, detailing her dreams for their child, a child he denied. Shame burned in his throat. He reread the letter again. He'd been so consumed by his own ambitions, so blinded by the fear of judgment from his family and peers. He'd thought he could simply erase that part of his life. A soft knock echoed, followed by Zara's hesitant entrance. She stood in the doorway, her eyes guarded, her posture rigid. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. The air hung heavy with unspoken words. I found this," Zara said, her voice barely a whisper, extending a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of a younger Arthur, laughing, carefree, with Eleanor by his side. Their faces were bright with happiness, a stark contrast to the grim reality of his present. Arthur took the photo, his fingers trembling. The image pierced him. It wasn't just a picture. It was a ghost of a life he'd buried deep within himself. The laughter in the photograph felt like a cruel mockery of his present misery, yet strangely comforting. I didn't know this existed," he managed, his voice catching. Zara stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "It's clear you had a life before the Empire," she observed, her voice still low, but now imbued with a hint of understanding. "One that you seemed determined to forget." He looked up, meeting her eyes. The anger, the denial that had fueled his previous actions, seemed to dissipate, replaced by a wave of profound sadness. The lines on his face seemed to deepen, etched by years of self-imposed isolation and a lifetime of hiding from himself. A silence stretched between them, filled only with the ticking of the grandfather clock. The city's relentless hum seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the weight of shared history. This was more than just a legal battle. This was a reconciliation with a past that had long haunted him, a past he could no longer ignore, a past that somehow linked him with this young woman. This fragile beginning offered him a chance at a future he'd never dared to imagine. The scent of old paper and leather filled Arthur's study as he meticulously catalogued Eleanor's letters. Each one was a tiny shard of a life he'd shattered, a life reflected in the faded photograph Zara had shown him, a younger, happier Arthur, laughing with Eleanor, their faces radiant. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window, a melancholic backdrop to his solitary excavation of the past. He felt the familiar sting of regret, a constant companion these past few weeks. He found a small, leather-bound diary tucked away in a box. Eleanor's delicate script detailed her hopes and dreams, her anxieties about their future, the overwhelming joy of her pregnancy. Arthur felt a tightening in his chest, a physical manifestation of his guilt. He read of her unwavering love, her faith in him, a faith he'd so brutally betrayed. A soft sob escaped him. He hadn't allowed himself to cry in decades. The years of carefully constructed emotional armor cracked, revealing the raw, vulnerable man beneath. He wasn't just confronting his past. He was confronting the man he had become, a man defined by fear and ambition. The sound of a gentle knock startled him. He wiped his eyes, hastily concealing the diary. Zara entered, a plate of steaming tea in her hands. The aroma of chamomile filled the air, a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. "I heard you were up late," she said softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the storm raging within him. "Just doing some research," Arthur mumbled, his voice hoarse. He gestured towards the scattered papers and photographs. Zara approached the desk, her gaze falling on the open diary. She hesitated, then quietly picked up a fallen photograph, a picture of a small child, a girl with Eleanor's eyes, a striking resemblance to herself. "That's me?" Zara whispered, a mixture of wonder and sadness in her tone. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. Arthur looked at her, at the young woman who held a mirror to his past mistakes, and saw not a threat, but a reflection of his own lost potential. A shared sorrow connected them, a silent acknowledgement of a past that had shaped their present. He finally saw her not as an obstacle, but as a path to redemption. The rain outside intensified, but inside, a fragile, hopeful light flickered. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Arthur's penthouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He awoke with a start, the lingering scent of chamomile tea and the image of Zara's tear-filled eyes heavy on his mind. He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years, a fragile hope blooming amidst the ruins of his carefully constructed life. He showered, the hot water a soothing balm against the lingering tension. He dressed slowly, choosing a simple shirt and trousers, a deliberate departure from his usual impeccably tailored suits. He wanted to present himself differently today, less like the intimidating businessman and more like the man Zara deserved to know. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, a stark contrast to the stale air of his study the previous night. She turned, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Morning," she said, her voice soft. "Morning," he replied, his own voice rough with emotion. He pulled out a chair, watching her move with a grace that belied the strength he'd witnessed in her. They ate in companionable silence, the clinking of cutlery a gentle rhythm against the backdrop of the city's morning hum. Arthur watched Zara, her face animated as she spoke about her plans for a new art exhibition. He listened intently, truly listening, his heart warming at her passion and her unwavering spirit. "I've been thinking," Zara said, breaking the silence, "about everything." Her eyes held a mixture of apprehension and hope. Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on her. He knew what she meant. The past loomed between them, a silent specter, but now, the chasm seemed less insurmountable. "I want to understand more about your past," Zara continued, her voice low. "The things you haven't told me yet." He met her gaze, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within him. Fear warred with a new and unfamiliar yearning for honesty and connection. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a testament to the years of suppressed emotion. "There's a lot," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "More than I can possibly explain in a single conversation." "I understand," Zara said gently, "but I want to start. I want to know the truth." Her hand, small and delicate, rested briefly on his. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through him, a silent promise of a future slowly being built on foundations of truth and understanding. The sun streamed through the window, casting a golden light on them, highlighting the delicate, yet powerfully hopeful, connection that was finally forming. Arthur spent the next few days immersed in old photographs, dusty journals, and faded letters. The scent of aged paper and forgotten memories filled his study, a stark contrast to the sterile, modern ambience of his penthouse. Each unearthed artifact was a shard of a life he'd buried, a life that now clawed its way back into the light, bringing with it a painful mix of regret and a burgeoning sense of responsibility.